And so now what I'd like to do is take us into the panel discussion. We've got 4 esteemed gentlemen who are going to come join me on stage. We've got Tom Horan, the Dean at the Business School at the University of Redlands, who you heard from this morning. We've got Mike Johnson in charge of business development for Esri Commercial. We've got Bruno Moser from Norman Foster. He's an urban designer from the UK, so it wouldn't be a complete presentation without an accent, apparently. And then we've got Brian Weinert from John Deere, who's the manager of analytics. And for our panel discussion over these next half an hour or so is we're going to just talk about these 4 concepts of digital transformation and get some perspectives beyond my own. So with that, I'd like to offer up the first question opener to Tom about how are you seeing digital transformation?
Thanks, Shawn. Well, I think we've seen in your talk and in the other case studies that there is not one pattern of a location strategy, throughout the private sector. And so I think thinking about different templates for such a strategy and the maturity that could come from that. So we've studied the public sector at length in terms of how it grows and gets mature with regard to use of GIS. There's probably many examples in the room, but there are inevitably different strategies for different types of industry. If you're a consumer-based industry, for example, linking up with consumer, informatics. If you're a location-based industry, it's probably going to come in through the infrastructure side. So I think the next step in our continued growth of GIS in the private sector would be to understand these kind of different templates for how to really grow the location strategy in the companies.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that from the group? As far as what we're seeing, do we think we really have an education opportunity? Is it because executives maybe don't understand GIS and geospatial in the context of how it provides business value?
I would say in my experience, that's very much true. That, there are, if we look at what you represent a little bit, Shawn, in terms of the adoption of digital transformation initiatives in companies, we see a similar kind of pattern, if you will, in businesses as it relates to location thinking. And I think, the comment Tom made earlier, Dr. Rand made earlier, in terms of the volume of location data inside of businesses, that's a statistic we've sort of reintroduced into the community over a period of time. It's still very true, but the awareness of the significance of spatial analysis against those data is still very much a work in progress, I would say. Now, there's some great examples we heard this morning about initiatives that companies are taking to overcome that and introduce their organizations to the significance of location thinking in their businesses, but it's really early. These guys, I think, also have some really good insights about that as well.
Okay, great. So how do we see, again, kind of leading into the second question of industry perspectives, and we talked a little bit about that, how do you guys see companies taking that DX journey, or are they? I mean, we've seen some great public sector examples. We saw the one that you put up there from the private sector, Dr. Rand. But is it, again, how are people looking at this?
Yeah, I would say again, so there's 3 or 4 thoughts about this. One is that it varies across industries. So organizations that are in industries that are highly geographically oriented, like the commercial real estate industry, like the engineering and design industry, tend to adopt and look at how location fits in to their business earlier than other industries. Interestingly enough, we heard an interesting example this morning about vehicles. The insurance industry was also an early adopter of how they used geographic analysis in understanding their risk. And as that industry has matured, greater and greater levels of granularity and detail in geographic analysis have revealed to providers of insurance new opportunities for business growth. So incorporating location analysis and location practices and processes into their businesses has really helped them keep pace.
Do you see the bigger opportunity in companies that maybe aren't as close to the end consumer, manufacturing? I guess maybe saying, if you're where you are in the value stream, if you're at a certain degree of separation from your end market, are they the ones that maybe don't see the compelling value yet?
I would say to a degree, yeah, not to dominate the conversation, but in those industries and organizations that are somewhat further removed from direct connection to the customer, they're driving toward understanding more about customer demand and customer needs. So they're introducing new thought processes around how to understand customer requirements. And it tends to introduce itself into some specific areas of those businesses rather than a sort of comprehensive digital transformation or location strategy for the entire company. There's a part of the company where location is obvious and critical, and our ability as manufacturers, like Deere's a great example, of introducing location into the customer base at the initiative of the manufacturer has been transformational for those businesses.
Okay, great. So going to our third point here, what are the key drivers and challenges in your experience to date? And Brian, we were talking last night over dinner about, Deere's done some really interesting and impressive things as it relates to using GIS and geospatial. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about that experience and what Deere's hoping to do and what they've done?
Yeah, thank you. John Deere is an old company, so 180 years old. Started with a self-scouring plow is how that began, a welder, right, in Illinois. If you think of what John Deere was, and even 40 years after that with the self-propelled tractor, which was a replacement for a horse, right? This is an old company that has a long history of engineering, providing equipment and a product. So, and another way to kind of highlight this, and I can see most of you, who here grew up on a farm? There's a handful of hands. How many of your parents grew up on a farm? Okay, so you're at least children of the salt of the earth. And how about grandparents? Okay, we start getting closer and closer, right? Now, who eats still? Okay, so we're all eating, right? So what we began as and what we are, or maybe even what we need to be in the future, may not necessarily be the same thing. And we have to have a vision for what that looks like. John Deere has gone from that point to all the different ages of the world, agricultural, manufacturing, the information age, now the digital or whatever's coming, the conceptual age, and as these shrink down. Who we are today is very different. So we're at the point now where precision ag, not just pulling a plow, but knowing every inch of every acre, everything you've put on it, everything you've gone over it. Our machines today are fully autonomous, where we're having real-time decisions being made by the machine, optimizing every single aspect of the farming operation and its production chain. An example of this, just again to highlight where we're at again today. I just finished a graduate program last year from Purdue, and one of the gentlemen in my cohorts is a potato farmer from Idaho, and whenever I spoke to him, he seemed to always be behind the wheel of his John Deere tractor, of course, and I asked him, how much of your program have you completed sitting in that tractor? He said 70 or 80% of his graduate program, he was farming, right? That's reading, that's writing.
Multitasking.
That's project group discussions and calls. That's where the technology has come, right? So part of the question here is, what's the driver? Well, everything's being commoditized. Equipment's just welding pieces together. Anybody can do that. So what's the next area? What's the driver? People are hungry for information. They're hungry for data. They're hungry for optimization, right? And the experience of Deere is a long-term view of saying, what is the customer going to need to do to continue to produce the food, the fiber, the fuel that supports the world.
Yeah.
And guess what? More horsepower was not the only answer to that.
It's great. That's a great example and great insight. And you think about the theory of scarcity versus theory of abundance, and I would say in that example, right, Deere has created tremendous value for itself as a brand leader and differentiator in your markets. You probably created tremendous value for the farmer because they understand soil and field performance relative to crop and yield. And that's been a win-win, hasn't it?
Yeah, and it's really the connection of all those things. This equipment's still important, but it's the equipment, it's the land, it's the input providers, there's the advisors, there's even the marketing. All that comes together in what you'd call a connected farm, right? And that farmer's no longer in bibs and overalls. He can wake up in the morning and see his entire operation, where all the equipment's running, how it's behaving. He can optimize sub-performing operators. He's looking at the world markets. It's all happening right at his fingertips. And fortunately, it's an easy connection for us because our customers, every one of them is tangibly linked to the land.
Shawn,
So it just makes sense.
I want to pick up on the precision part of this, because maybe it's not just precision agriculture, but so much of the economy is about precision. If you look at the growth and productivity over the last, since 2009 really, and it's come through efficiencies and stripping out waste and so on and so forth. So I think there's precision in healthcare, because it's so expensive. How do you get to that? There's precision in getting the consumer exactly what they want, and how you do that. And so if you take that for a moment, then the issue becomes, what is the locational element to that precision? How can location, knowledge of the characteristics of it, help in being as precise as possible, whether or not it's in agriculture or healthcare or consumer goods? I think that precision is a key part of continued productivity growth in the United States.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And as oftentimes when I present, I talk about all production systems have the potential for infinite capacity until you bind them to time. And distance impacts your ability to have productive time. There's a reason in lean you do waste walks and eliminate unnecessary steps or distances. So I would agree exactly with your premise there. So, great. And then kind of touching on our last question is, what is your DX maturity today, and what are your goals for tomorrow and why? And Bruno, I'd ask you to lead off on that based on your role and the work you do and what you see with your customers and markets.
Thank you. We're really service providers in the area of design. So we do architecture and urban planning. And I can sort of try and answer your question maybe from two different angles. I think one side is for us as a business, we're probably not in a bad place, I would say. I think the office has always been very much interested in technology, and there's been strategic investments for many years or decades even to try and build strong relationship with software providers and so on, to make sure that we're at the leading front of that development. I think we were the first architecture company to have a 3D printer in the office. We're using augmented reality and virtual reality and all the lots to communicate and explain our projects, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later on in our last session today. As an industry, I think there's been a dramatic shift in the last couple of years. Really, we've gone from making drawings by hand and drafting into computer-aided design, where you do the same thing effectively in a digital space. And probably about 5 years ago or so, the idea of a building information model became sort of state of the art, which effectively is a GIS system for architects. So the elements that you draw, a wall has a material, and the door have numbers and material and phasing and so on. So we're adding attribute data to elements, and it's a really sort of it's created a shift in the way we work, because suddenly we're sharing information models with all the other consultants, so with engineers and service providers and people who do structure and so on. And that's both positive because it makes the process so much more streamlined, but it also really sort of challenged all the way we work quite dramatically. And I think the challenges today are to establish the standards to which all we work, and I think that's something that applies probably to many areas inside sort of digital transformation. and sort of upskilling the staff, because suddenly the piece of software that we knew no longer worked, and also figuring out how a piece of software that does one job really well, which is managing enormous amounts of complicated data, might not be the most creative design tool. So how do we engineer that, sort of integrate these different tools back together? And I think we're only at the beginning of sort of seeing the reward of investing into these new technologies, where the construction process starts to change, because suddenly the contractor knows very exactly when which door is required. So the management of sites and so on is completely different. And also then, I think once the building is completed, that information model feeds into the facility management. And again, I think there's lots of benefits, but I think at the moment we're sort of going through the pain of investing into technology and getting our heads around it.
That's great. And again, do you see over the coming years that this will create that same kind of, theory of abundance value realization for everybody in that?
Yeah, I think. Yes, there's a sense of, and I think we're lucky because we are sort of one of the largest practices in the UK, and you get a bit more resource, and it makes things easier. But I think the challenge for some smaller practices is to invest into completely new technology, which does have considerable cost impacts, and sort of waiting until the benefits sort of start to reap in.
Great. Any other thoughts on this last question from the other panel members?
I think the last point that Bruno made is a really important point. And that is that there's two dimensions to this topic. One is the industry dimension that I mentioned earlier, that those companies that are customer focused and connected closer to the customer and have geography in sort of their typical workflows are early adopters. But it's also that the bigger companies have the resources in order to innovate in a different way. And what is interesting about our economy is that there's such a large proportion of the economy that's driven by smaller businesses that the distance and transferability of what we're learning about innovation and digital transformation starts to increase between the big guys and the small guys. And there's some interesting implications there for us as organizations, as technology builders, as academics, as industry professionals, to think about how we close that gap and bring the economy with us by, collaborating and sharing with smaller organizations.
Do you think there's some maybe inertia or just lack of large companies who have the resources, right, who have scale?
Yeah.
Their boards and their senior leadership don't see it as a compelling thing to put energy around. I mean, we were speaking yesterday, and Brian was describing, and Mike was describing that, Deere came to Esri because they had an idea, they had a strategy, and they were already pulling that strategic rope.
Right.
And a lot of companies, you can't push the rope, which is either the technology, either the platform, or let me tell you why this ought to be good for you. But what perspective do you have on that with some of these large companies? Are they early on? Are they getting it? They're not getting it based on?
I'd have a comment that, and this is maybe a learning or teaching for all of us that are in an analytics space. I'm not a geospatial professional. There's people on my team that certainly are. But with anything in terms of analytics or this whole digital transformation journey, we need to be more than question receivers and answer givers, right? When those queries come in, and if we just give them back the answer that they thought they wanted, we've lost a huge opportunity. I think we need to be teaching our leaders, our senior leadership, the management, the source of the questions. I think we need to do a better job of storytelling, right? How does this fit in the larger context of the company, of the customer, relative to our competitors in the industry? And we need to do a more engaging job with the data that's so available to us, that's so obvious to us, whose value is so readily apparent. We need to package that in a way and give it back to the business that compels them to want more.
That's a great point, yes.
Yeah, picking up on some of the earlier comments, and we were talking about this last night, it strikes me that in the public sector, there's been a notion of GIS as a platform, and somewhat in real estate ones where the location is so important. For other industry areas, and perhaps even for small businesses, a platform's a big thing to bite off, more of a service. And I can think about this healthcare, a company that we worked with and actually worked with Esri on, and you go and talk to the CIO, and he's like, "What? Another platform?" Right? I am platformed out. And we just think of all in healthcare, and I think it was a little bit of an upstream situation that way. Whereas, well, what is the service? What's the product that you're going to get from it? And I think it may be that in the private sector, both of those, should exist simultaneously, particularly for a small scale business that can't really afford to invest in a platform, but they want some of the analytical results.
I'm glad you made that comment. We at IDC are having this discussion now about, you want utility. Don't buy a house, rent a room, or rent the house. And it goes back to, if you think about if you're the CFO, and I know that's not this audience, but traditional IT and technology buy, and this is part of the CIO's dilemma with trying to get capital, is you buy the asset, you book it to your balance sheet, it depreciates over a period of time, and then it's wash, rinse, repeat. Buy another asset and let it cycle out. So this notion of how do you transform to the economics of digital in terms of renting utility and not taking a big commitment financially, but getting the benefit of the utility as a rental cost.
Right.
I think another interesting aspect maybe is also to think about the way the organization is made up. And I think we are at the moment in time where a generation younger than us and younger than me grows up with the technology in a completely different way than we did. And I think often the senior management doesn't have that same experience. And I think when we look at what some of the younger architects do in our office in a sort of, in half an hour, it's absolutely amazing because they have a completely different access to technology and what technology means. And I think for them, it's much easier to understand what the benefits are, finding new ways of designing in a more interactive way, etc. And I think it's sort of, as you said, it's explaining also to the senior people within the office of why that's important and how that can help. And even though it might be different from the way we've done it in the past, there's obviously great benefits in doing that and listening and giving people an ear.
So do you see HR and that cultural transformation as being really critical for organizations to maybe effectively move forward at a different level and scale than they have to date?
I think so. At the end of the day, one needs to have the knowledge and the insight and to do the right thing, but then you also need the people who steer the boat to be able to give these people space and the opportunity to explore these areas.
Interesting. Great.
And I think that plays over into the academic area too. How does academia prepare those new employees that we are looking for to be comfortable introducing transformational ideas into organizations that are run by old guys like us, right? Because it's an important, the pace at which business is evolving and needs to evolve in order to continue to be competitive and integrate the content and rapid fire of data sources is just, it continues to accelerate. And what we're looking for, what Esri's looking for, what you guys are probably looking for, are those bright minds that come out of school and can engage with us in meaningful ways that help us accelerate at that same pace.
Yeah, I think that goes back to your credit of, your school has this GIS MBA program. How many other schools out there, to your knowledge, have something similar to?
A survey was done a couple of years ago, and it was like 5 full scale, and then drifting down from there. So it still is kind of growing. I think the bigger point is how do you get it into the pipeline of management education? And I think the way into that, we're in Redlands next to Esri. We're a spatial university. It's in our blood, in our DNA. Well, what do you do with other universities that may not have that same circumstance and characteristics? I think the way to do it is to have management education both have a broad component, in other words, understand the various aspects of business and business society, and an analytical component. and to get spatial analytics to be in the toolbox with consumer analytics, with financial analytics, and just get it to be one of the 3 or 4 things that a student can choose. And I think that's going to help with the pipeline. The other part of the pipeline is, of course, the demand for that person out in the marketplace. And as that continues to grow, and we've seen it, really tick up in terms of interest because they can get a great job afterwards.
Oh, great points. So just in closing, I'll ask each of you, what seminal guidance would you give the audience or people that want to learn more about this or engage digital transformation as it relates to GIS and geospatial over the next 6 months to 5 years? So Bruno, I'll start with you, if that's okay.
So I missed the beginning of the question, sorry.
So what's the essential guidance you would give to the audience about furthering their capabilities, education, awareness, et cetera?
I think events like these are a great opportunity because I think it is about sharing and learning from each other. And we all sit in our little boxes and think we're the only ones struggling with a specific problem. But I think actually realizing that when we come together, there's other people who face similar challenges, and being able to sort of bounce ideas off and is really sort of incredibly important and helpful.
Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, my thought, we're all at some level spatial professionals, or what was it? Spatial transformers? Is that what it was? And it's, I've for a long time felt that part of our role is to educate the organizations that we work with. And the challenges that we talked about earlier, which is that many of the businesses that we work in have limited understanding at executive levels of the contribution that spatial analysis can deliver to the organization. And I think a key part of our role is to take what we learn here in events like this and during this week and carry that back into our organization and have sort of a bold attitude about it, to really go after that level of conversation in the organization to inform and educate senior leadership about the value of location.
Great. Brian?
I would say let's not get too caught up or in love with any particular technology or perspective. What we should be caught up and care about is what value we can provide to our customers. Let that guide our decisions. Let that decide or drive the tools that we pull out of the toolbox that are available to us to deliver that value. And so long as we keep that focus, I think it's more easy to take this journey and to bring your organization with you, so long as everybody rallies around the customer and the value provided to them.
I think that's a great point. In fact, in doing Lean and Six Sigma years ago, people get enamored with the tool. And it's not about the tool or the tech, it's about that outcome. So I think that's really great to hear you talk about voice of customer. And so what are your thoughts about how people should think about it and where should they go next to further the cause?
Yeah, it really is this interweaving between the business focus, which should lead, as you said, the customer, the objective, and the enabling analytics and technology to get that done. And so I think if someone's on the technology side and as a champion, working with somebody on the business side to be the business champion for it is a great thing. If you're on the business side, work with the technology folks to get some synergy and some alignment between what are the business problems or opportunities and how can this technology help. Because you can't have one without the other. And I think getting that alignment between the business and the analytics is the key goal.
Great. All right, well, thank you all for your time today. I give my colleagues here a round of applause. Thank you. And so to close out, we ran a little short because we wanted to give you some of your lunchtime back. If there was supposed to be a slide, did you guys have it here? Anyway, there's a website or a web address or an email address, right? If you have any questions or follow-up. Mike, what is that? bizsummit@esri.com.
B-I-Z.
B-I-Z.
If you do want to share questions or comments with the panel here or with Shawn, you can send a little note over to that address and we'll pick it up.
Great. Well, thank you all for your time today and enjoy lunch and enjoy the rest of the day.